My name is Helena Soimakallio. As the chair of the organizing committee of this SB11 Helsinki World Sustainable Building Conference. Honorable Ministers, Member of the Parliament, distinguished CIB, ESB, unit executives, esteemed delegates, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the organizing committee of this SB11 Helsinki, I'm pleased to welcome you all to this remarkable event and to Helsinki. Finland got the opportunity to host SB11 2 years ago. Although the schedule was very challenging, we were excited and enthusiastic to bring the international community of sustainable building specialists and experts together here in Finland. The aim of the Congress is share the leading knowledge and best practices of sustainable building. I'm positive that upcoming 4 days will fulfill all our wishes. And today, over 1,000 participants from all over the world, we are from over 60 countries, have arrived here in Helsinki Exhibition and Convention Hall. The delegates and exhibitions are made of a wide range of operators and experts in the field. We are researchers, we come from industry, we are planners, contractors, and naturally representatives of decision makers. Ladies and gentlemen, as the chair of the organizing committee, I would like to thank all Finnish and international co-organizers of their efforts to make this conference successful. Finnish organizing partners are VTT, the Technical Research Center of Finland, and Finnish Association of Civil Engineers, where I come from. And I would also like to thank you very much, Sitra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, and Tekes, the Finnish funding agency for technology and innovation, for their role and active support of this event. I'm also very pleased to see here many representatives of our international partners, such as International Council for Research and Innovation in Building and Construction, meaning CIB, International Initiative for Sustainable Built Environment, ESB, and United Nations Environment Programme Sustainable Building and Climate Initiative, UNEP SBCI. I would also like to give my sincere thanks to our sponsors. Uponor is the platinum sponsor, Hong Kong Green Building Council, Peru, Tiles and Bricks Europe's TBE, and the Ministry of Environment of Finland as silver sponsors, and Helsinki Region Transport, HSL, for their financial support. Likewise, my very warm thank you for you all. You are the core of this event as participants. Particularly those of you who are in Finland for first time, I wish our country will leave good memories and also bring some nice experiences outside this venue. With these words, I declare the SB11 Helsinki World Sustainable Building Conference to be opened. I wish you a very successful event for all of you. And now I have the honor and pleasure to give the podium for the chairman of the International Scientific Committee of this conference, Mr. Pekka Huovila from VTT. Pekka, welcome.
Esteemed guests, dear colleagues, it has been a long journey for us to come here from where we were 2 years ago when we started to organize this conference. It has been a long and winding road, one may say. Many things have happened in the world during that period. If you remember the ash cloud events in Iceland, severe floodings in Australia, also the unfortunate tsunamis in Japan, but also events in Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, or Syria. So we live in a global world, and the impacts not only from the climate change, but also the economic, social, and societal changes, they influence in our lives. This 6th edition of this prestigious Sustain Building World Conference series lies still on a solid foundation of the previous ones, held recently in Melbourne, Tokyo, before that Oslo, Maastricht, and Vancouver. We have this time also tried to introduce some new things here based on the feedback received from the earlier conferences. Like you see, this is a bit, let's say, rescaled, the event, compared to the previous 2 ones. And also the scientific content has been very much focused here. We have collaborated with 7 scientific journals in order to let's say, improve that part to an even better stage. In addition, we have organized international student competition, and even children have been working on sustainable neighborhood regeneration, and you'll hear those results in the special forum this afternoon. In addition, we have a so-called African Star seminar tomorrow evening, close to this place, and we have also collaborated with the Finnish National Audiovisual Archive that shows films related to this topic during this week. But this conference wouldn't have been possible to organize without your support. We received over 1,000 proposals as presentations for this event, where the 300 most suitable ones were picked to be orally presented in our 51 sessions here. And they were reviewed by 332 sustainable building experts from 73 countries, which we highly appreciate. So it was really an international effort. Finally, as a chair of the International Scientific Committee, I warmly welcome you to enjoy these 4 days here, and hope you take the opportunity to network here and also make new friends. And I wish also the talks we carry on here will transform into action that will make our planet a better place to live, both for us and for the future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Pekka. By the way, one of the new features of this Sustainable Building World Congress is that we have audience all over the world outside this hall, because we are live webcasting the opening and the whole day, and also this material will be available after the Congress, so you can share the experience with your colleagues later on. Now, the sustainability, I think, is the key issue of well-being in the future. And we have the great honor, we have here today the member of Finnish Parliament, Ms. Tuija Brax, and she's also the chair of the Auditing Committee of the Finnish Parliament. Please welcome Tuija Brax.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's really an honor to be here today. First of all, I come from the Green Party, and seeing you professionals sharing the same goals and aims, trying to, and probably not only trying, but going to save the planet is remarkable. I'm really pleased to be here today. But on a personal level, I have to say also that it gives me a great pleasure to be among professionals of building industry, since I'm the black sheep of my own family. All of them all of them almost, are in building industry, besides, except me, I'm a lawyer. But I try to do my best, and I sort of, around the kitchen table during all my years, have tried to learn the best out of the building industry as well, so we'll see. I was one of the negotiators of the new governmental plan for the new government of Finland, that is the government of Prime Minister Jyrki Katainen. And in our program, the government decided to have as one of the main goals to not only to combat climatic change, but also to combine that combat with possibilities to create new growth, sustainable economic growth, new opportunities, new working places. And the way we are going to do it is sort of a pattern we learned in the early 90s. I'm not sure if you all know or are aware of the fact that we had a really bad, almost a collapse of our economy, at least a really bad recession in the early 90s after the collapse of Soviet Union and before the Eurozone came into the picture in our economy. And what we did turned out now, afterwards, it's easy to say, a good model to tackle economic crises. The whole country really did sacrifices. There were several cuts-offs in our budget, also when it comes to welfare, the sort of structures of welfare states. So everybody could feel that the economic times were difficult. But at the same time, we put more effort, more than ever, in new ways of creating growth, in inventions, in the way that business, but also then the university institutions could put more input in their work in order to find new ways, not only to combat already then existing environmental problems, but also to create new jobs and opportunities. And this is exactly the same pattern we are going to do now. And now I'm sure you are all aware of the economic crisis at the moment. And that's also one of the reasons why, to you that are following the European debate right now concerning Eurozone, why the Finnish government is one of the hardliners when it comes to combating and overcoming these Eurozone problems, that you have to face the facts, you have to do the necessary cut-offs, but at the same time, as also said in this 2020 program of the European Union, you have to be really progressive, brave, and really we are talking about big changes in how much you invest on inventions. We have to create a business environment where it's very lucrative to invest on new inventions, and that's what we are now trying and going to do with our new government led by the Prime Minister Jyrki Katainen. And that's where this building industry, of course, comes into picture. Particularly here in the Northern Hemisphere, it's not a marginal question. It's one of the key elements how Finland will fulfill the criteria of Kyoto, but also even go beyond that we will find new sustainable ways of building. The business sector of Finnish building family has been really active. I'm more than pleased that during last weeks we've been able to read from newspapers that there are several projects also here in Helsinki, but also in Tampere and other big cities that are going to be started concerning building out of wood. And when you use wood, of course, it's probably known to you all, you restore CO2 emissions for decades. And that's one of the things the government is really putting efforts on. But of course, there are other things, not only, but one of the main things for the government is to enhance using wood in building industry. But technology is there as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I was really happy when I saw that one of the reasons this seminar is held here is that you have these 3 goals already mentioned improving quality of life, mitigating the effects of climate change, and making new business. Because this is exactly the same goals that we are having here in the governmental level. But I was also very happy that you didn't only set up a goal to learn from each other, you that are already experts in this field, but also to get everybody involved, also children and young people involved. And just to give you an example why I find it important that it's not only a question of experts learning from each other, that is very crucial, but also for experts learning to share the information with the rest of the world and the public, is that the audit committee of the Finnish Parliament that I'm chair of, we just established a relatively big study and scrutinizing program concerning the questions and worries concerning indoor environment of building, the mold problem among others. And one of the things we already learned when we did our background studies was that it's not only the quality and the inventions that you professionals are doing and the quality of building, and particularly when combating climate change, also the new methods to save energy but not to spoil the indoor space, but also the way you learn to talk and communicate with the public. Because one of the things we found out in Finland, and I don't know if that's the case in other countries, is that reason for bad indoor environment, even for mold problems, is that the younger generations don't know how to live in a building. Don't know sort of everyday life questions like that. There is a reason why you have to take the leaves in autumn out of the roof to guarantee that the water will fall down, and particularly after the winter when the snow is melting down, that it's not something that your father just did it for the sake that your mother demanded that it looks nice, that it's something that needs to be done to guarantee that the building will be in a good shape. We have learned a lot already in the audit committee, but one thing is sure, we need your support, we need your expertise. We are going to face such a great demands on how to cut down CO2 emissions, and particularly in living in houses, that I'm really happy that you are going to be here for the next 4 days. You are going to provide a lot of information for us, and we the decision makers, it's then our duty to listen to you and really, not in a decade, but immediately then learn and also put them then into practice. So I wish you a really good seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuija. I was always wondering why my mother ordered me to do those things, but now it's clear. Anyway, it's time to move on towards our morning session keynote speakers. And the relevance of time is very important also when we talk about sustainability. Nowadays, and even more in the future, sustainability turns into a business, for example. But what is the relevance of time will be lightened during the next hour. So I have the great honor to invite Richard Lorch. But before that, I also like to point out that the Journal of Built-in Research and Information has a very long association with the Sustainable Building Conference series, and also a strong track record on resources and research on this topic. So please welcome Richard Lorch and take over the podium.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As mentioned, I edit a research journal, Building Research and Information, that is celebrating its 40th year. the idea of 40 years prompted us to pause and reflect about time. We need a bigger perspective, the sense of time, to understand the sustainability changes that have successfully occurred and grasp why others have failed, or at least not being taken into society. Understanding this unfolding of events can shape what we do for the next 40 years. We're highly conscious of the need to accelerate our actions, but now we need to develop appropriate policy, pathways, and actions. It's only slightly more than 40 years ago that we began to have images like this from outer space. For many people, this profoundly affected their understanding of the finite nature of the Earth and of our place within it. Since then, we've all become acutely aware of the many pressing environmental changes, including the need to reduce atmospheric greenhouse gases. Over the next 40 years, significant changes are needed if global warming is to be kept within reasonable boundaries. That's one of the reasons we're here today, but it's not the only reason. This larger sense of time means engaging with multiple perspectives, not only the Western world, but the developing worlds of Africa, Asia, and South America. We already appreciate the unfolding of many different needs, but we need to acknowledge and plan for several different future paths. So what we'll be doing for the next hour or so is unique. In this session, we'll hear 4 snapshots, 4 different views from BRI authors to open up the debate on how we foresee our roles as researchers, as practitioners, as business people, and as policymakers. These presentations will then be followed by 2 brief responses. The point is to initiate a challenge. What can we realistically expect to achieve over the next 40 years? As humans, we typically conceive of programs and plan activities 5 to 10 years ahead into the future, if we're lucky and if we're good at it. Perhaps this has some biological basis. However, environmental challenges require thinking over a sustained period of tens, if not hundreds of years. So this conflict between the short term and the long time frame is particularly relevant to the built environment. The built environment changes slowly, it has long lifespans, and influences consumption of significant resources. This paradox was best summed up by Stuart Brand, who said, "Responsibility means mastering long lead times, long lag times, and the hidden effects of cumulative change." So time is the hidden factor. This focus on time is particularly apt within the context of sustainable development. The past century has experienced enormous technological innovation, globalization, population increase, and environmental degradation. Within the human sphere, they have negatively influenced our perception about time. But an increasing focus on the short term risks desensitizing us to contemplate the longer term. This short-term focus about time is an intergenerational framework. This is the key cultural problem that we face, ladies and gentlemen. So to engage with a wider time perspective, we'll have to reframe how we discuss time and how we situate ourselves within it. Danny Hillis's Clock of the Long Now is one way to get us to think about a much longer time frame, a clock that has something special happen every 100 years and is designed for 10,000 years, puts our lives into a different perspective. But for research, practice, and policy, the use of hindsight, looking back, and foresight, looking forward, are useful approaches. And backcasting also provides an opportunity and a way to set future goals and then work back to the present with detailed steps towards those goals. A first step for reinstating the capacity to think beyond the short term is to look back 40 years and to look forward 40 years. 80 years is the average lifespan. Understanding the extent of change that occurs over a generation is going to be crucial. 40 years are also a way to connect to the medium term by asking, how did our parents or grandparents live, and what were their levels of consumption? Some very interesting work coming out of the Swiss 2000 Watt Society, which I'm sure we'll hear more of over the conference. Crucially, the built environment affords one of the few significant opportunities for addressing time as a long-term phenomenon. How cities cope with pressures and accommodate change, how they provide continuity, and they also have the potential to control or exacerbate consumption. The predominant focus for the past 40 years has been on buildings, creating greener buildings. Typically, this is framed perhaps too narrowly within a set of technical issues, and insufficient attention has been given to social, behavioral, and cultural issues, as well as governance. And we need to think and work at both the building and the larger aggregate scales. The emerging discourse on vulnerability and resilience in cities is a modern interpretation of time. As we'll hear in a few moments, the rate of urbanization is creating problems not only for the immediate absorption of people, but for planning over the medium to long term. The capabilities of cities to absorb a rapid influx, provide a quality of life for its new inhabitants, and to stabilize their hinterlands are key questions. And over what time frames can this be done? So what's missing? A major challenge for the next 40 years will be the delivery of capabilities for implementing change. This entails not only the change of mindset, but also practical skills and services. And this is where the professionals and the research community come in. It's crucial to ensure that buildings perform as intended and that we understand and influence how buildings are actually used, not how we think they're used, not as hypothecated entities. A fundamental change is needed in how professionals define themselves on ethical issues as stewards of the built environment and stewards of the natural environment, and on a practical level of ensuring their services actually deliver the intended outcomes. Although the construction industry does vary from country to country, the underlying question is whether the individual professions, firms, and project teams can have a greater role and responsibility for the performance of both buildings and cities. 4 unique perspectives will be presented to stimulate core discussion and thought over the course of SB11 and beyond. Following these 4 speakers, we'll have 2 brief responses. And it is hoped that this session this morning will help to enlarge our collective sense of time, not to forget the lessons from the past, to have the confidence to think several generations ahead, to redefine our roles as guardians and stewards, to understand the vital need for policy engagement, to acknowledge the different paths to the future, that there's not just one path that might suit Europe or the West, and of course to explore the implications for our future agendas. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce and call Ray Cole to the stage. Ray is the next speaker, and Ray is known to many of you. He's a professor and past director of the School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Ray, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. It's my responsibility, in this opening session to present the changing context in which the environmental debate as it relates to buildings has played out over the last 40 years and maybe anticipate what it might be in the future 40 years. So this is the time period from 1970 out to 2050 is what I'm going to try and present a picture. One's faced with a number of difficulties here, of course. Whereas the past and the present are somewhat known to us, the future is always going to be speculative. We may be able to discuss the nature of preferable, plausible, and possible and probable futures, and maybe even present those in terms of a pessimistic futures or very positive futures, but nonetheless, any future will likely be speculative. So the way I want to conclude this session is to end up not by actually presenting a future, but try and anticipate what is likely to become more important to us in the building community and what is likely to become less important as we move forward. Of course, the story can't begin in 1970. We have to go back maybe a long way to fully understand the context which we find ourselves and actually maybe what the future may unfold. Certainly Western societies remain largely entrapped in the Cartesian, Newtonian, mechanistic worldview that had its roots back in the mid-17th century. This is a worldview that implicitly places human enterprise dominant over and essentially independent of natural systems. What we saw, of course, in the late 19th century was the emergence of biology and ecology, and this essentially challenged the primacy of reductive thinking, which had been evident for the previous 2 centuries. We have indigenous cultures that have always understood, in many ways, a more holistic view of the relationship between people and natural systems. And I think now we begin to understand ourselves that we are indeed integral to and interdependent on natural systems. So the issue is, in a larger way, is not what the future buildings is going to be, but what will be the prevailing dominant worldview in the future. Which one of those plays out will profoundly affect just how we progress in the kind of decisions we make relative to buildings. If you start to unpack this a little bit closer, we start to look at what reductive thinking has given us. The behavior of the whole can be analyzed in terms of the properties of its parts. This is a characteristic of most building environmental assessment methods. We understand individual performance attributes and somehow imagine that the sum of those gives us an understanding of what the performance of a building might be. By contrast, systems thinking, where I think we have to move towards, posits the idea that properties can only be understood within the context of the larger whole. And that's going to be a position I'm going to start to unfold as we move forward in this presentation. We have seen a shift clearly from the machine metaphor to now a large acceptance of the network metaphor, where it's not the individual pieces that become important, but the links and synergies between them that start to assume a greater importance in a future evolving environmental discourse. We can look at components. Again, we have a great deal of knowledge and understanding of components. But clearly, what we really need to understand, in this instance, an example, the bicycle, understand how the bicycle represents behaviorally and culturally a fundamentally different position in terms of within the wider societal context. Again, it's on this right-hand side that I'm interested in pursuing where the seeds of a future discussion might unfold. The more significant thing, I think, of this last 2 centuries of reductive thinking, it's left us with, individually and collectively, with ingrained biases that favor simplicity, certainty, and immediacy. We have Stuart Brand's book that Richard referred to just a minute ago, The Clock of the Long Now, where he opens up the book with a statement essentially that society is on a pathological path of the short attention span. We can't think past next weekend when environmentalism requires us to take the long view. So this idea in terms of how our worldview constrains us and how we have to change that to imagine how we can begin to engage in the larger future becomes extremely important within this discussion. 1972, very close to 40 years back, was a remarkable set of publications which came out and represented, if you will, the very tenure of the times. It was very much about understanding the necessity to live within the biophysical limits of a planet, a single planet. And what we were seeing in terms of what was understood at that time, that we indeed were moving and surpassing those limits, and we were on the threshold of environmental collapse. That was very much the times back in the early 70s. Also, we started to see the emergence, if you will, of small, appropriate technologies with the idea that they indeed empower people. I want to refer back to this because I believe we're on the threshold now of another movement which is about empowering people to take more control of their lives. We maybe want to understand what the actual technological base that gives it that opportunity. Yes, I thought I'd throw in a few photographs from the family album. If you look closely, you can probably pick me out. I will give you a few clues. But yes, this was all about the emergence and the technologies of a counterculture. Again, I believe that we're on the threshold of a new counterculture, but the technological base of that counterculture will be qualitatively different from what we saw in the early 1970s. These are two publications back to back, if you will, one from 1971 and the other from 1992. They reflect an enormous change that occurred in a 20-year time frame. Back in 1971, the issue of progressive architecture, a North American architectural magazine, the theme of that issue was life support systems for a dying planet. Nothing captures the tenor of the times more than that statement. Of course, then we had the Rio Conference on the Environment and Development, and that was one where the emphasis was that we need to come together and show greater levels of stewardship as we move forward in terms of our understanding and engagement with healing the planet. So if you now start to look at what we've actually moved through in terms of some of the dominant ideas, they are really quite remarkable. Back in the 70s, when you had issues of limits to growth and survivalism, if we believe indeed that the world was coming apart, then the notions of autonomy and bioregionalism started to become front and center, certainly within that counterculture. We have the 1980s and the energy crisis raising the terms conservation and efficiency. Then we moved into this period in the 90s of responsibility and stewardship, and the term green started to appear. With that, we find the emergence of building performance assessment tools, integrated design, life cycle analysis, all in many ways speaking of some sense of taking on responsibility. Then we have events like 9/11, where the notion of security starts to become important. And terms like future-proofing, passive survivability, self-reliance, again, become very dominant terms in the discussion about green building and green building practice. Sustainability, of course, since 1987, has been an overarching term that we use. Today, the discussion somewhat is actually quite narrow. It's about mitigation and increasingly maybe thinking about the importance of adapting to a changing future. But we have performance goals like net zero energy and carbon neutrality for buildings being a dominant part of our performance aspirations. I believe that we're moving into a different kind of period where the notion of localization and regenerative design will start to become important, and notions of decentralization, the importance of place and indeed local networks and systems will start to dominate our discussion in the next 10 to 20 or 30 years. If we start to look at the scale of intervention, over the past 40 years, we've seen the emergence of the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Within a very narrow window, they've released essentially four assessment reports. We expect that the fifth one, when it comes out, will paint an even more dire picture of the situation of anthropogenic carbon emissions and the consequence of its exacerbation more further of climate change. We've also seen United Nations climate change framework, the committed conferences, the parties. You've seen this, the most important one that we use as the benchmark still being the Kyoto conference, but every year there's been a major and important gathering of international leaders to try and hammer out some international agreement on the curbing of greenhouse gas emissions. This report was extremely important for me. It came out earlier this year, and the fundamental conclusion from this report was that a comprehensive international climate change agreement will probably be possible only when a critical mass of countries is committed because of self-interest rather than perceived altruism to take insufficient action. Nobody will act for the common good. We only act, it seems, when it's in our self-interest. If this applies to our world, at what level should indeed this self-interest play out? At the level of the building, the level of the neighborhood, the level of the city, the level of the country? That becomes an important discussion for us. Again, despite the importance of the work, this has been a kind of a critical statement here, if you will, be made, that we may have to wait a long time before we indeed see any collective agreement internationally on the curbing of greenhouse gas emissions. And clearly, if that's the problem for us, because if we're not prepared to change our ways, then for me, you see these absurd recommendations or ideas being put on the table. Geoengineering, the idea of actually sort of iron seeding our oceans, of cloud seeding our skies, for putting thousands of mirrors into outer space to reflect back the sun. This, indeed, is not beautiful technology. This is big and ugly approaches and extremely dangerous, but because there seems to be no significant shift on our part to change our ways, then the notion of large-scale technology seems to be maybe emerging in the background, and hopefully it stays in the distant background as a possibility. Of course, over this period as well, this past 40 years, we've seen the growth and influence of multinational corporations, all-encompassing systems of trade and finance, mass tourism, all these things collectively interlocking the world into a single global culture. The general agreement on tariffs and trade, which morphed into the World Trade Organization, in many ways being the embodiment, indeed, of that globalized change, certainly when it comes to industry and finance. Of course, globalization has many critics, but yet it remains pervasive and its momentum still amazingly overwhelming. It's quite remarkable to me that Peter Buchanan, back in 1984, made this very prophetic statement that somehow the notion of a truly universal civilization, and that somehow we may be in the midst of a very traumatic period prior to the birth of a viable global civilization in which networks of communication and trade will no longer be homogenizing and destructive agents, but will have sufficient capacity to allow regional peculiarities to survive and be savored, i.e. the global culture will mature to such an extent that it will permit within that this condition, encourage that depth of experience that comes from being rooted in and caring for local issues. The relationship between the local and the global starting to become extremely important within any current and future discussion. I'm going to go back and look at another globalizing issue, communications technologies. Now, I'm sure many of you in the audience had, and maybe even still have, that 128K power machine, Macintosh, when it came out in 1983. Of course, that was interesting in and of itself, but 1992 saw the real power emergence of the World Wide Web, and we've seen a whole range of new technologies, new communication technologies emerging. Now, clearly, small has become beautiful again. We hold it in our hand, and basically it gives us access to a whole range of new possibilities that we didn't have, clearly, in the 70s. Now, this is kind of intriguing. When you start to look at world trade, in terms of resistance to the World Trade Organization, this is not basically people rioting in the streets. This is people queuing up outside the Apple stores for the latest and greatest piece of technology. So we've embraced one technology and essentially opposed another, but both have their distinct characteristics. Because if we look at information technologies, we are moving presumably towards a fully interconnected world, where numerous invisible, omnipresent, always-on communicating computers embedded in everyday artifacts and environments. This may be one scenario for the future. And indeed, what does that bring? It brings us this condition of placelessness, digital access from anywhere to anywhere. So in the same way that global trade has essentially spawned a context for localization, communication information technologies now are maybe placing greater need to stimulate ourselves in identifiable and meaningful physical places. Both those two dimensions of globalization are clearly creating a context for the importance of place as an essential component that needs to be restored, understood, and cared for as we move forward in environmental discourse. Over the past 40 years, we've seen the emergence of building environmental assessment methods. For me, one of the most significant, if not the most significant development in building environmental assessment methods has been the fact that all the major developers have introduced a version for communities or urban design. The scale has gone up from individual buildings to another scale. This, for me, is enormously telling and enormously important. We've seen the characteristic of many assessment tools, a declaration of performance requirements and the idea that we will add those together to get an overall measure of the performance of a building. I think we're starting to see those tools being complemented or replaced by others. Tools which talk of place, tools which look at the flows from nature, how we use it and how we return it back to nature, and how we start to look at the synergies and links between all the components that place a building within the context in which it sits. I would argue maybe these are going to emerge in the future. Just to wrap up, I thought I'd go and look at the American Institute of Architects, their conference theme in 1971. It's an intriguing read. 1971, The Hard Choices. Look at the questions they posed themselves in 1971. What should be the patterns of human settlement at the national, region, and local scale? i.e., there was clearly a discussion about differences playing out at different scales as being represented in their aspiration. Within these patterns of dispersion, how do we use all our human resources? This was back in the 70s, clearly in terms of how do we employ human resources in that context. What do we have to give up to create a livable environment? Seemingly a conflict between environmentalism and the quality of life. This was the 70s. Now, if you go and look at the American Institute of Architects 2011 conference, look at the title. Regional Design, Revolution, and Ecology Matters. Innovative approaches to planning, design, and construction, along with evolutionary or revolutionary approaches to practice, collaboration, and partnerships can create more resilient urban ecosystems where cities of all scales contribute to a region's sustainability and regeneration. Again, the American Institute of Architects concerned with buildings, they frame it in terms of the scale of their concern as being cities. Very interesting indeed. So, to wrap up my presentation here, I set myself the task of trying to understand what may become more important in the future. And I think it's going to be this co-evolutionary and partner relationship between human and natural systems as being presented by those advocates of regenerative design. Place, the notion of place will become extremely important. Greater self-reliance at the local community level. Systems and synergies, the way in which we can see links and synergies across multiple scales and between various systems will assume considerable importance in our discussion. Stakeholders. Clearly, a numerous range of stakeholders are involved with delivery and maintenance of buildings, but what we will see, I believe, are new forms of cooperation, partnership, and information exchange between them. Now, what's likely to become less important, and this is dangerous turf to be on in front of this audience, I believe that the primacy of individual building as the focus of environmental performance will diminish. Building performance goals. Performance goals, I believe, for individual buildings will be set within the larger, more comprehensive community goals. The notion of carbon neutral building disappears. The notion of carbon neutral community gets more significant, and we understand what the contribution of individual buildings are within that larger community scale goal. Building environmental assessment tools will be complemented initially, and I suspect replaced by those that identify links and synergies at different scales. So with that, I conclude my presentation for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. Thank you, Ray. Our next speaker is Alfred Ngawi, who's talking on rapid urbanization in developing Africa. Professor Alfred Ngawi is the Dean of the Faculty of Engineering and Technology at the University of Botswana. He has been a consultant in construction engineering and management for small and medium-sized construction companies. Alfred, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My presentation is rapid urbanization in developing Africa. And if you look here, Africa is a vast continent. But generally, it can be divided into three major periods. First is when African tribes were administering themselves. Second is when they were administered by foreign powers. And the third is when they got flag independence. So the first period is characterized by several tribes which clustered in productive areas, and they made living out of these clusters. For example, we see the Bantu were cattle headers who were also farmed and lived in grass-veld areas. We see example of Basarwa in southern Africa, who inhabited Kalahari Desert and made a living through hunting and wild fruit gathering. We see the Maasai tribes, which herded cattle and migrated in search of pastoral lands. So the common theme here, you see the settlements which they have individual houses, but they had common areas which were administered by the community and not by individuals. We also see a feature that the inhabited areas which were close to infrastructure and the other resources. And when it comes to individual buildings, they made sure that the communities lived in harmony with nature. They designed their buildings which took cognizance of climate and available materials. And this is how intuitively these communities achieved sustenance. But as time went on now, during the second period, there was a scramble in Africa, and the way of life changed. And it became now a bit of more industrialization. So for example, the industrialization of South Africa attracted bold men from across the region. And one example is that during independence, over 30% of Botswana men between the ages of 20 and 40 years worked in South Africa. So the effect of this one, it deprived their communities of the able people who could work in their communities. And you can see the settlement pattern which we saw earlier, which was ordered by the community, now become just structures where people no longer have the community sense. And the implication here is that there was the abandonment of the vernacular settlement system, and the repercussions were lack of adequate infrastructure and disruptions of ways of life. So now the new nations when it came in, it brought now migration from the rural areas to urban centers, because the urban centers seem to be where the resources were placed. And the statistics shows that by year 2000, about 34% of sub-Saharan African population was urban. And that was a shift of 62% over the past 15 years. So the effect of this is that vernacular knowledge was drained, there was a loss of self-sustenance, and then local economies were disrupted. Now this extended to the current state, where we say now, the structures which we have today is completely different from the original communities. We are not saying that we have to go back to those structures. But what it says here, there is no identity of the initial living with what is happening today. So now the result of this one is that there are insufficient resources, there are high levels of corruption, and there is a wide inequality in wealth. So the three characteristics of the current state is that there is a big divide between rich and poor. The economies are still depending on commodities, and then there is a dependency on handouts, either from government or donor agencies. So we say then, the social changes which have taken place is that there is a land conflict, where now people are saying the large chunks of land which are owned by people, what is the legitimacy? And there are cases where I find that people invade land which were owned by others in the urban areas and build shelters. And there is a big tendency which has come in here of xenophobia. You might have seen the television, what happened in South Africa and the surrounding areas, which led to Nelson Mandela to remark that sub-Saharan Africa is the only region in the world where urbanization is associated with negative economic growth. So other challenges which have come in is lack of housing. As you can see out here, that the housing which are out in place here are just ramshackles. Then the basic health services, you can see now the infrastructure, the urban drainage here is just a makeshift. We can talk about the transportation. You can see the road here, and the means of transport is actually motorcycles. And then there is a large amount of unemployment. You can see the young people out here are actually roaming around without proper work. And then the loss of culture and indigenous knowledge, which was in the past. So now, looking forward in the next 40 years, what is the future? And here we say we would like to do planning for sustainable future, whereby we need to resolve land issues by making rural life as attractive as urban life. Because it is clear that if urban life is better than rural life, there will always be movement from the urban areas to the cities. Then we need to provide basic human needs. Then reinforcing the existing social concepts of harmonious living in cities and urban areas. And the important one is that we plan for climate change through research of what can sustain a modernized traditional life. What we are saying is that you don't have to go to the past traditional life. What it is that you pick what is good in the modern life and incorporate in the traditional life. So if you look at the structures out here, these are the typically traditional structure, which are using the traditional materials. And what we are saying, we have to carry out proper research so that we don't just replace the traditional material with the modern material without knowing the implication of such kind of replacement. We say further, we need to be able to empower indigenous populations, because at the end of the day, it boils down on the people. If people understand and they take the issues in their hands, then we are going to have a transformation. For example, the people will be able now to optimize land. Then we need to have knowledge creation and transfer of skills so that people can be enabled to carry out the activities. And then we carry out community participation. When communities participate, you find actions take place. There is a living example now in Malawi, where Habitat for Humanity works with local and district governments and the national authorities, and we can find that the things have started taking place. And we believe that if people are empowered all across Africa and developing Africa, the changes will take place. So the next thing we say now, what is the ideal cities for people in Africa particularly? And here we say an ideal African city model has these 5 features. First, it's built around people by using innovative ways to improve their ways of life. Instead of imposing new ways of life, we look at how people live and then develop out of that system. Then the second one is that we need new economic and planning models that reward long-term thinking. Because most of the time now, we try to solve short-term problems, and actually they create even bigger problems for the future. Then we need to be able to celebrate Ubuntu, that is a harmony with people and nature. And this interprets in the urban life. And then we need to be able to adopt locally conducive planning and building codes that embrace flexibility. Because most of the codes which exist today actually are inhibited instead of facilitating innovation. And then we need to be able to develop urban strategies with environmental ethos. And finally, here we need to be able to harness existing skills and empowering local people to create input into the development. Because often you find that people are told what to do instead of actually involving people from the beginning to decide what is going to be the development for their areas. And then we say now, what are the research challenges for the SB11? Here, we see what you like here is that the future cities which embrace placemaking, people, and mixed use. So to be able to achieve this then, we say we need to recognize cultural influence on urban design and technology. We talk about this one, but when it comes to practice, it is not done, especially in Africa. Then we need to understand enabling processes for local communities. Because for each community, we try to understand what really makes them to progress. Then we need to have appropriate policy formulation. Because most of the policies actually, like I mentioned earlier, are hindering instead of facilitating. Then we need to have transfer of appropriate technologies across urban and the rural divide, because it has happened that the technology has just been transferred without knowing and looking and studying the appropriateness. Then we need assistance to create vibrant smaller towns with self-sustaining economic systems to remove pressure from big cities. Because in Africa, there is a lot of land. The question now here, instead of concentrating development in the big cities, it's better to develop small towns and make sure that we take development to those areas so that we remove or we reduce the rural-urban shifts. Then finally, we need to shift the research innovation from looking at buildings alone, where we have done very well, but now we need to take it to urban scale. So finally then, what lessons can developed nations learn from African experience? And we say the most important one is the spirit of Ubuntu as part of urban fabric and culture. Because we say in Zulu, Umuntu means that a person is a person through other people. If the other people don't recognize you as a person, then you are not a person. So Ubuntu is a spirit which you like to take you from rural areas to urban areas. Then we need to have deeper respect for nature, because everything we do, we have to look at nature first. What is the effect? Then living within the limits of available resources. Because here, if it's possible for people in Africa to live in less than $2 a day, it is possible also for other people to try to reduce their consumption to something which is available. Instead of saying because they have access, they can use as much as they can. Then you have to have to understand social connections as a basis of resolving social challenges in urban habitation, because this has happened in the rural areas, that the conflicts are resolved because of that social cohesion. And this is what can be transferred into urban areas as well. And finally, we like placemaking based on people's cultures and ways of life. Because the basic thing here now is that when people go to a new place, their culture should also be reflected on where they move to. And ladies and gentlemen, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alfred. The next speaker is Professor Bhajan Lee, who is talking about China's rapid urbanization, challenges and opportunities. Professor Bhajan Lee is the Dean of Faculty of Urban Construction and Environmental Engineering at Chongqing University in China. His research activities are in the field of low-carbon design and sustainability in the built environment. Bhajan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my great honor to be here to talk about China's rapid urbanization. Back to the 40 years ago, China in the Great Cultural Revolution. In that time, the people stopped work and stopped study from the university. And China in that time, their influence in the world economic is minimal. Since then, China experience the rapid urbanization and economic. So the economic development and the start is minimal, and now is the second biggest in the world. And the urbanization, the region, started from 20% in the 1970s, and then nowadays is 50%. So this means about 0.5% people now live in the city. And China, with the urbanization, the city geographic is changing. For example, this is 1995 Shanghai. This is the urban areas. After 10 years, in 2004, Shanghai, the urban area is doubled. And more people come from the farm countryside going to the city. But however, because the China special policy for vehicle, and in China, they classify two kinds of vehicle. One is for citizenship in the urban, one is for the farm. The farm going to the city for living, but is work, no problem. However, whatever the man yes work, most people, the family still very hard to settle down permanent in the city. So then, every Chinese New Year and also long week national holiday, 100 million people travel around. So this is last year, the people in the Guangzhou railway station. So every city, the railway station, like this one, even in the airport. And also the people habitat and the expectation has changed. For example, in the 1980s, the people have the bicycle. Every family have at least one or two, but now is gave up for the private car. The car ownership and is raised. Last year, 10 million private cars made and sold in China is the biggest by the number. The car is not a solution, it's a part of a problem. And China every year build 2 billion square meters, the new building, the equivalent like the total the size of the New York. So this means last year China built one New York City, and this year and another, and the next and the next. And also the building energy consumption is counting about 30% the total national energy. So how about the future? Maybe history we could to look at. So this is the map of the new American energy consumption, started from the 1950s by use the air condition. And then take 20 or 30 years, the energy consumption is rise, and then peak it. China currently in this level. So people will ask, how many years China's energy consumption will be continue to rise, and how big? So this is the answer, and we would look at. So this is the energy consumption in China and the world. This is the picture we look at. And American and China is two biggest energy consumption in the world. However, the interest we look at, so the left side, the half energy consumption by the developing country, they're counting about less than 30% the population. So if we look at this one, the energy consumption by person, the American current about 12,000 kilo the energy. China current by person is just 2,000. If we look at Japan, we know Japan economic high efficient, but they're still counting 6,000 kilo per person the energy. So if the China, the habitat and they followed with the style, and like American will be 6 times bigger the energy consumption. If this really happen, I don't think it's good for everybody. So what is China and the energy consumption? We look one of the example for the thermal conflict. This is the map of the China from the north to the south, very cold, colder. And by the history, and the only north part of China allowed it to heat the building in the winter. However, for this Yangtze River, including Shanghai is there, and my city, Chongqing is here, is about 32 million population. So this area is counting about 40% GDP, is one of the biggest, one of the richest areas in China. The weather condition in winter is cold, in summer is hot. How cold, how winter? We look at it. So this horizontal is the outside temperature, and the blue dot is the north part of China, inside the air temperature. The red one is the source, is the source. So we look in the summer, and the outside temperature is 30 to 40, and for the north and the south, indoor temperature is over 30. I'm interested for the winter. Outside temperature in north part of China is minus 23 degrees, but inside the temperature is around 20. So the temperature difference inside and outside is about 40. And however, you look at in the south part of China, outside temperature is about 0 to 5 degrees, but the inside temperature most time is lower than 10 degrees. How people is survived? Look at the picture. You know in China is one child only. So this is our little king and little princess. The little king and the little princess dress like this one. This in the classroom is a form study. So nowadays, the China, the marketing economic, and the China had the money. So the people just simply going to the marketing, buy the air conditioning units. They want comfort, they want warm in the winter and cold in the summer. So if this habitat and the energy may be tripled. So China, how to deal with? How to go into sustainable? Chinese government make the promise, China will cut CO2 emission 40 to 45%. China take it seriously. For example, in 2007, China State Council gave the order. So all the public building in China, air conditioning units not allowed if the temperature is under 26 degrees. And nowadays, in China, going from the green, low carbon, and eco-city, we know 2008 in Beijing, Olympic is green. And we know 2000 Shanghai Explore for low carbon. So 2011 is the eco-city. So nowadays in China, low carbon, green building, eco-city will lead the sustainable development in China. And also, of course, international cooperation is really needed. So China operation for the experience and pay more attention to international collaboration. China welcome international experts involved in China development and share the responsibility. So the conclusion for my presentation, China urbanization is one of the most important influence on human process in the world. After more than 10 years, after more than 2 decades, people's living standard has significantly improved. China recognizes both the environment problem and the limit of the consumption. What is the future? For the next 30, 40 years, it have the potential to swift its focus on both the management of the exploitation and the new form of the urban living. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Bill Bordas, who will be talking about built environment professionals, 40 years back, 40 years on. Bill Bordas is known to many of you. He's a scientist who studies technical and environmental performance of buildings in operation, and he works closely with human factors specialists. He's also research and policy advisor to the Usable Buildings Trust. And I should also add that Bill is a guest editor of a special issue of New Professionalism, and there's currently a call for papers. So if you're interested or working on something around this topic, please have a look at the call for papers. Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everybody. I'm having a thought about professional services, looking back and looking on, and sort of with a snapshot from the UK, though when I talk to people from other countries, they think that often the experience is not very dissimilar. So, past, present, and future. I sort of tried to summarize the last 5 decades in one word each. So, here are the words, and just looking at what was going on, in the general sort of social and political environment within which professionals work during these decades, when all these other things were going on that Ray described very well. You know, looking back, it's extraordinary that the limits for growth and things like that were 40 years ago. But essentially, in Britain, we had this sort of major ambition post-war in the 50s and 60s to reconstruct the country, and we were doing some fantastic things. There was a lot of optimism about science and technology and reason, major projects, but then it all started falling apart in the 70s. Suddenly, you know, big tall buildings collapsed. Large redevelopments of cities, etc., were socially unacceptable in various ways. Some of them had to be demolished. And then we had the oil crisis came along and massive unrest. And we were really sort of looking at sort of reorientating. How could we make things more sustainable then? But then in the 80s, the brakes came off. It was less about a social enterprise, more about individualism and markets. And Britain was very, very lucky because even though many other European countries were constrained on fossil fuels, we used to have lots of coal and then we had oil and gas. So, you know, we were swinging away with all of this. And then at the end of the 90s, we had some major financial shakeouts, but there was a collapse of the Soviet Union. Capitalist triumphalism. So all of a sudden it was more individuals, more markets, and government got rid of its technical skills. They were all outsourced and privatized. The fuel industries were privatized. The building research establishment was privatized. So essentially a public institution set up to close the feedback loop in the understanding of building performance, though we don't need that anymore. And then for the last 10 years, it's been terribly paradoxical. You know, we've had Rio and Kyoto and all this sustainability stuff has really been coming up. The sustainability assessment systems have been coming up, but the markets have been doing a very different thing. Big ambitions, iconic buildings with hardly any foundation in building science or sustainability. And these constraints really coming on. You know, peak oil, peak of gas has hit Britain very hard in the last decade. We stopped being a net fuel exporter in 2005. So things are very, very different. Now, what about professionals in this environment? 50 years ago, there was a lot of trust. Disappeared in the 1970s, but so did continuity of work, so did the difficulty. It would get much more difficult to hold integrated multi-skilled practices together. And then in the 1980s, was already thrown away. You know, professions were seen as just another business. They should be competing. So all of a sudden, people couldn't pull together necessarily under the architect a good design and building team because the client shopped around from here and here and here and slung people together. And then particularly in the last 20 years, much more privatization and outsourcing, a government policy focusing really on construction, you know, building buildings better, but not tuning into building performance. So what we've got in this paradoxical 2000 is we've sort of been relying on markets to do things which markets haven't been very good at. So we've started to have to bring in regulation and assessment systems which tell people what to do, but actually it's not necessarily releasing their imagination. We're getting more and more green red tape, as we call it in the UK. So where are we with all of this? This actually dates back to the predecessor of the Sustainable Buildings Conference, the Green Building Challenge Conference in 1998. And in Britain, we wanted to look at buildings, only those which had track record of performance. We went to see one. And we saw several, but this was one. So the designers predicted an annual carbon footprint from its gas and electricity use of something like 50 kilograms per square meter per year under the BREEAM estimate, the design estimate. The actuality was about 2.5, 3 times that. Now the problem is nothing much has changed. So it's 35 years since the oil crisis. We know we need to make things more sustainable. We can't even make the things energy efficient. I mean, it is quite extraordinary, the lack of connection often between intentions and outcomes. And so what we see is people extraordinarily, until recently, it's been not just the designers and builders, but also the owners and operators who've been blind to the fact of actual building performance. Unfortunately, when this cartoon I commissioned 10 years ago, we didn't put a policymaker on here, because the policymakers were also often in the blindfolds too. And it's not just about energy and carbon performance. What we look at buildings in terms of occupant satisfaction and other stuff, we find here, if the building's red on these scales, it's worse than average in occupant perceptions. If it's amber, it's no different. And if it's green, and this building, which won an award 2 years ago at school, is only green on image to visitors. Fantastic, wow factor, marvelous building, but not working. And yet we got lots like this. What we find all the time is one of the problems is we're making buildings too complicated. And often now we're making them complicated in the name of sustainability. But what we find is often for sustainability, we want to keep things simple, do them better. Design intent not communicated well. This came up in some of the earlier talks, you know. Essentially, people in buildings don't understand how they're supposed to work because it's not made very clear explicitly or implicitly. Sorry, the click didn't work. Ah, yes. And then we've got the most ridiculous systems for procuring and changing buildings, which assume that you're doing something, that you know what you're doing, and you can do it routinely. It's all supposed to be right first time. But how can it be right first time when you're supposed to be innovating? Innovations have good and bad consequences. We need to learn about them. We need to close the feedback loop. And then we've got outsourced facilities management. And, you know, facilities management claim to be the experts in running buildings. But actually, the most profitable things they do is what they don't do. So essentially, a whole lot of aspects of fine-tuning of getting the performance right is not occurring out there in the marketplace. So really, you know, we've got to have major improvements in our existing and new buildings. We've got completely dysfunctional systems. So what are we going to do about it? If the market doesn't seem to be getting there, it's certainly not getting there fast enough. Here are some schools in the UK. This is the carbon, well, no, this is just energy, sorry. This is provided by Partnerships for Schools, who actually can't publish it, but they lent it to me, I'm glad to say. So what happens is, this is the 10% benchmark with heating, fuel, and electricity for a database of British school performance up to 2003. This is the requirement for a privately built and financed school. And here are some schools that have come up the production line. There are more of that. So you see, every school except for one that's been recently completed has a bigger footprint than the requirement, let alone where somewhere 10 years ago in terms of measured performance. Now, there are lots of reasons like that. Schools are getting more like offices in the UK. But the other interesting thing is you see this green bit down below. That's the renewable contribution. And essentially, some of these schools have big amounts of renewable energy, photovoltaics, biomass, etc., but they're not energy efficient. And what we're finding is we've got a policy to encourage renewable energy, but instead of being put on top of an energy efficient building, it's been on top of a rubbish building. You know, again, too much stuff, not enough performance. We've got to do it differently. So here's Frank Duffy, the past president of the RIBA, who actually in an article in Building Research and Information, which you can read. In fact, you might even be able to download it free during the conference, I think. I see from a flyer that was in my conference pack. You know, we've got to do things differently as building professionals. We have to tune into outcomes. So what I'm saying is if we want to change things quickly, it's difficult to get markets to move, but our minds can move very fast. We can think differently tomorrow. So how can we actually get around improving process, product, and performance? Well, we've got some levers in the UK. The institutions for architects, engineers, and builders say their members need to understand and practice sustainable development. How on earth can you be doing that if you're not tuning into the consequences of your actions? So shouldn't we change the nature of the job? We don't actually hand over the keys and run away. We stay around to see how things perform. We redefine the perceptions of the role in relation to that. We can go away and do that tomorrow. So we can close the feedback loop. We can find out what we're working. We can get research much closer to practice and policy making. And we can get it done on the job. Now, one of the things we've been working on, and there's more about this by my colleague Rod Bunn on Thursday in a session, is what's called the Soft Landings Framework. And that said, in order to get buildings delivered more practically, what we needed to do was prepare for handover better and do more aftercare and fine-tuning, but that wasn't enough. If you wanted to get things to perform better, you had to, at the beginning of the project, say, we're planning for this. You had to manage expectations during construction, and then you had to hang around not just after the first few weeks or months, but a little bit longer to find out how things were actually working in the end of the users. And you don't have to change anything you do in order to adopt this, you just clamp it onto the side. And there are a few leaflets at the side about what we found applying this to schools. We've got to redefine this. There's a big job to do. We now got very much less money to spend. We can't change everything tomorrow, but we can change our attitudes. And it's not a question of whether we can afford to do it. We've got to do things differently. And we can start now. We don't have to wait till 2050. We can think differently from now on. Thanks very much.
Right, you've heard 5 presentations. We're now going to have 2 responses briefly to our presentations, people who will pose some further questions. The first one is Ilaria Ajo from the Uponor Corporation. Ilaria, the floor is yours. Can we take the...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the presenters for excellent presentations, and a very good morning to all of you. It's a thrilling opportunity to be here and contribute with my small, modest, humble attempts to the discussion. And it's especially thrilling since I was just informed that there are people all the way out in New Zealand hearing this over a webcast, which is, I think, a fantastic sign of how we can interconnect, as Ray said, and share ideas. Some people in the audience might know me from the past. I've been involved in these conferences for quite a long time now. For the last years, I've been looking at these things from an industrial standpoint, and this is my angle for responding to some of the points that have been raised here during the presentations. We've heard an excellent overview on scoping the frames that we need for turning our branch and the industry and the built environment in general towards more sustainability. We've talked about time frames, the need to think longer, both in terms of the future and the past. We've talked about spatial and societal challenges that imply that we need to be able to respond more on the community level than on the individual buildings and products levels that we've done in the past. And latest, we were talking about the need to redefine the role of the professionals, which is, of course, I think we can all sign under that statement. Now, looking at this from the industry point of view, there's one thing we as the industry and all of us maybe in this room also need to understand and accept, and this is that there is, even though we all warm-heartedly agree with everything that has been said, there is an inherent misalignment between the time frame aspects of sustainability and the time frame type of thinking in the current business and industrial environment. It's a no-brainer example to say when my colleagues were talking about intergenerational time frames with regards to sustainability. We in the industry struggle to think operationally in periods of weeks or months, and the best of us are able to think strategically over a year or maybe 3 years. Most of us concentrate in thinking on quarterly terms, and you can imagine for yourselves how difficult it is to perceive an intergenerational benefit of something when you are using most of your time to consider what's going to happen with the economy in the next quarter. So that's something that we need to be able to bridge. There's another misalignment that Bill was very well touching here, which is the sort of misalignment between the notion of professional stewardship and us on the individual level, changing the way we think and do things and carry our own responsibility, and in the way we as companies tend to look at not individual responsibilities, but what we tend to call in business jargon as customer-driven core competencies, which is a terribly ugly word, isn't it? Sometimes these things don't go hand in hand. But the point I'm trying to make is, rather than spending, again, this conference in complaining about this misalignment and mismatch of the time frames, I argue that we would instead need to accept that this is a fact of the matter. We need to accept that at the end of the day, it's the short-term looking businesses that need to deliver the change on sustainability in practice. We need to accept that for delivering this change, we need to build the necessary capabilities, and we also need to accept the fact that for capability building, we need the necessary resources to be accumulated now, not in 50 years' time. So this time frame misalignment needs to be bridged, and on both sides we need to understand this. All these capabilities that we need, for me, these define something that in the business jargon is called the business model. And here's my main research challenge. I remember saying this also to the SB10 audience a year ago in Espoo. For me, the main research challenge in bridging this misalignment gap is how do we, academic, neutral, impartial research and discussion into how do we design, develop, and implement business models that simultaneously do four things. That provide for delivering sustainability and performance on the long term, at the same time by incentivizing sufficient, reasonable, short-term earnings and profits to create the necessary resource base for doing this, because otherwise it will be impossible. That will allow us to leverage on the individual's professional skills rather than only on the tomorrow's perceived immediate customer need. And going back to what Ray was pointing out, to enable us to really play in a network service delivery environment for communities. This is maybe the most fundamental thing, because as much as I look around me in the world, it's really difficult to find businesses that operate for the purpose of providing services and performance to communities. There's an abundance of businesses operating on the building level, but not for the communities. I will be happy to have the opportunity to be here with you for the days of this conference, and I will be eagerly waiting to hear hints towards discussing how to re-engineer the business models of the industry to be able to address these challenges that have been thrown at us in the previous presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I'd like to call Professor Thomas Lutskendorf from Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, also to give a brief response as soon as we get the laptop working there.
Dear colleagues, dear friends, please let me try to respond to the keynotes with help of some last and additional slides. I try, together with you, to solve some questions, the old questions and new questions during this conference, and to think about questions for the next period of research activities. And, of course, we have to discuss what does it mean to all of us. I think from the beginning, the concept of sustainability was to find a certain balance, a balance between social development, economy, and environment. And so from my point of view, perhaps it's not the best idea to use a metaphor of three pillars. Perhaps we have to think in ratios. What is the ratio between quality of life and impact to environment? Because this is necessary to think how we can adapt these principles, how we can adapt this concept to the different actors, to the different parts of the world, and to the different objects of assessment. You can see in some parts of the world we have a good quality of life expressed in Human Development Index, but we need too much resources, we cause too much impacts. But in other parts of the world, we have heard about this, we must improve at first quality of life, so we must adapt this strategy always. So we come out with some more important question. What are justified human needs in categories like living area per capita or thermal comfort in winter and summer? Perhaps we have at first discuss our needs. Later on we can discuss how we can qualities like quality of life, user satisfaction, and urban quality become more mainstream, and how we can assess this. From my point of view, it's a question of target setting. At the moment, we have changing goals and moving targets. So perhaps this is already a certain confusion around us. Perhaps the approach of sustainability seems to be too complex. So it's possible to identify and to solve the conflicts between different targets, and we really need just one goal, or we need really a wider basket of sustainability targets. Let us discuss this too. And there is a new main focus at the moment, which is fine to think about net zero energy buildings or net zero emission buildings. But how we can realize such a concept in a more sustainable way? We should not stop about thinking sustainability assessment for each building, so also for net zero energy building. And what about, and I agree to you, Ray, what about net zero emission neighborhoods and cities? And it's a question how to achieve a goal. It's not just about target setting, it's also to develop a certain strategy. So it's better to have a few large step changes, or we need a step-by-step system, a step-by-step solution. And what does it mean for the regulators, the investors? And how it's possible to take into account the innovation, the scope and the speed of innovations. Sustainability, sustainable development is a very complex thing. And so sometimes it's hard to integrate this into your personal decision if you are well informed about the impacts caused by your society or caused by your country. Typically, people start to think about their budget, about their financial budget if they start to come out with a construction project. Why we should not have personal budget for resource consumption and environmental aspects. So perhaps in future we will have 300 to 500 kilograms CO2 per capita a year as a budget. And what does it mean for buildings, their operation and the lifestyle, and perhaps also for the comfort levels? And what about the other stakeholders? We are well informed now by Bill about the designers and engineers, and Ilaria show us how industry can overtake responsibility. But what about the demand side? What about capital providers, the developers, the investors, where they are? So from my point of view, we must come from green talking to green walking. But to be a green leader, you must not just be a high personal commitment, you must also be well educated, and you must be able to measure the impact of your decisions. I think all here in the room can agree to me that the old idea of homo economicus is out. We are here dealing with sustainability, and we are here dealing with real estate, so we are the good guys. But it's sufficient to have a hope for legislation or to wait for the forces of the free market. I'm not so sure about this, and so I agree to Bill, we need a new professionalism which takes responsibility for society and environment. And how can we demonstrate, and I think this is the most important thing, how we can demonstrate that the goals of sustainability do match to a very large extent with the goals of the actors and stakeholders. How we can integrate this into a business case, how we can show green is good for asset value. If you are interested in topics like this, I invite you to special forum number 5, dealing with procurement, special forum number 6, dealing with integration of sustainability aspects into property valuation, and the special forum number 9, the needs of investors. Kiitos and thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you to all of our speakers. Please join me once again in thanking all of the speakers for their presentations. I'd just like to leave you with the words that the thoughts and challenges that were expressed this morning, we hope that you will take with you into the sessions that you will proceed to today and for the next 4 days, the forums as well, and back into research and practice. And we look forward to seeing how this unfolds and develops in further discussion. So thank you for your participation and support.